So, why do companies contribute to open source? Yes. Sorry, hello everyone. Okay. Yeah, so when you ask this question, in general, the answers you get back are sort of like wishy-washy and feel-good answers, right? It's like, oh, we contribute back to open source because it's for the common good, because it's the right thing to do, to pay it forward, etc., right? And if we put those on the scale, all by themselves, that's really nice. It tips the scale towards the idea of let's contribute to open source. But the problem arises as soon as other people in the company bring back sort of like objections they have to having folks contribute to open source. And you have multiple. Usually you have the legal team that is upset about losing intellectual property, about increased risk. You will have, for example, product being worried about losing competitive advantage if everything is open source, or like of open sourcing software. And then you will have, even like engineering leaders saying, well, who's going to pay for those resources that are going to be contributing to open source? And also, we don't actually know how to do that properly. So, how do we do it? And basically, while we're now at a position in time where we have a really good understanding of the return on investment of using open source in our own products, we don't really have a good answer to what's the actual value of contributing back. And the other aspect, of course, is we don't really understand what risks they are well. And when we do, we usually see them in like a very exaggerated fashion, pretty much like we're all very scared of sharks, whereas like actually dying by a shark bite is not a very frequent thing to do. So in the first part of this presentation, we're just going to talk about like two key benefits of open source. First one is strategic, and the second one is what I call second-order benefits. So I'm just going to start with strategic, give you two quick examples of how open source is used today by businesses to basically improve their bottom line. So one of the strategy that's often seen is commoditizing your complement. So if you look, for example, at Google, well, Google's business is in search. And in order to get eyeballs, well, it's basically selling ads after search. And in order to get eyeballs on that, what they have done is commoditized the solutions that bring these eyeballs to their product, right? And so both Chromium and Android are two large Google products that help them, help them with their business objectives. Similarly, Intel's business is selling chips. Software, CPUs, and it's not surprising that they are the biggest contributor to Linux because that is the complement to selling chips is an operating system, and it's much better for Intel to have a free open source operating systems than to be completely dependent on vendors like, for example, Microsoft. Red Hat, second biggest contributor to Linux, selling services on top of it, so that makes sense too. And Facebook is an interesting one here because you can look at Facebook's business model as one around the data mining of user habits and behavior. And so it turns out that data centers are quite expensive, and that's one of the reasons why Facebook started the Open Compute. What is it called? Open Compute Project? Yes, Open Compute Project, which is basically open sourcing hardware and server designs in data centers. And so again, that has helped commoditize and create a whole standardization of hardware that they can use in their data centers and have much cheaper because there's a lot more competition in that space. Another very common strategy right now, which is you'll see a lot of the, Gilles was talking about that earlier, a lot of the cloud players actually using that is using basically the fact that developers, when they start using open source software for prototyping or as part of their hobby work, then tend to bring those back into the enterprise, into their jobs. And so actually having a good way to on-ramp developers from open source to paid solutions, enterprise solutions, when they're actually deploying in production software solutions is also a very commonly used strategy. That's one of the reasons, for example, that Microsoft bought GitHub recently, right? So we can now, yeah, like now to look at what I call second-order benefits of open source. I don't know if you're familiar with this diagram. You've probably seen it online. It's a process diagram where you have, yeah, I like it. It's funny, right? So you have basically as input problem and coffee, an engineer in the middle that creates a solution and has as a byproduct sarcasm. So if you look at that and do it for software engineers instead, well, nothing much changes except your solution is now expressed in code. What happens when that software engineer now works in like open source? Well, you suddenly have this pool of commons, right? This software that's shared by the community, and you have this the source, you know, the output of that engineer's work that goes into that pool. And soon, you have a second software engineer that contributes to that pool too. And what happens next is really interesting, is you start having interactions between these two engineers through lots of different means, right? So these could be just conversations on a mailing list, could be through pull request reviews, mentoring, networking and events, and so on and so forth. And so if you remember this byproduct that we had originally, that was sarcasm for an individual software engineer, when these interactions also have their own byproducts, right? And there's actually a lot of them. And they go from, you know, adopting best practices to improving soft skills for engineers that are working in like a, you know, an open source environment. And what's interesting is you can actually classify those basically in 4 broad categories, which are benefits at the project level, at the individual level, at the team level, and for corporations. I don't know how much time I have left. 5 minutes, okay. So I'll move on quickly. I'd like to look at 2 examples of those that I find particularly interesting. One is a research by Frank Nagel that was released not long ago, which showed that for teams contributing to the Linux kernel compared to teams that were not contributing back to it, teams were actually twice as efficient working on their own project as teams that were just freeloading over the project. And it's not like 5% more, 10% more, right? It's like 100% more. And there are 2 main reasons to that, which Frank Nagel talks about in his research. The first one is, well, they just get trained by really good engineers working on the project on a day-to-day basis, right? If you think about it, a pull request, getting someone to review your pull request is basically having one of the best person in the planet on that particular software telling you how to improve your code freely on a competitor's time, right? So it's like very, you know, a very effective way. And the other part, which is really interesting, is the network that you create when you work in the open source. You basically create a network that allows you to really quickly solve problems when they show up. So, you know, this bug that would take you like a whole week to figure out is maybe just like a short email away to have a really simple answer to if you know the right person to talk to, and that person will actually listen, you know, will actually consider your email because you're part of the community. Another common second-order benefit of having a strong open source culture, like having a strong culture of contributing to open source, is of course the HR angle, right? The recruiting and retaining angle. And as an example, Facebook, before it was, when it was, you know, this really hot tech startup that was about to IPO and didn't have all of the privacy issues that it has now, you know, despite it being extremely attractive to engineers, just as it was, in surveys that were done with engineers that had accepted a job offer there, 75% of them said that the open source program that Facebook had was a key reason for them to do so. So even for a hot startup, it's still something that's really important to consider. And obviously, if your company is not a hot startup, like, yeah, it's even more of a good example. So what have we done here is we've basically packed full of nice benefits on our scale and trying to tip it And if we really want to be able to tip it all the way, what we have to do is have a look at those issues with open source and see what we can do to make them lighter in terms of weight. So we'll look quickly at two of them. One is the idea that we're losing a competitive advantage. So this is a very famous Wayne Gretzky quote that's used, like overused probably in presentations, but it's really interesting. It's the idea that copying as a business strategy is seldom a good one. And so the whole idea of actually being worried that others are going to copy you and not open sourcing things because of that is generally not very founded. The second one, which I think is really interesting, is the lost intellectual property bit, which is one that I hear a lot. And there's this really interesting quote from Yann LeCun, which used to be the head of AI at Facebook, and which says, I quote, "In today's world of fast-paced internet service deployment, owning IP has become considerably less important than turning research into innovative products as quickly as possible and deploying them at scale." And so, you're basically making a trade-off between having great teams that can innovate and keeping the IP, right? And if you think about it, having great teams, you actually get that by having teams by having a strong open source culture, because that's what attracts talent and creates innovation. And so with that, we're tipping our scale way in the direction of actually contributing to open source. And so, of course, every company is going to be different in that regard, right? So what I'm trying to do here is, first of all, give you a way to think about this differently, which is tie open source to business objectives and consider it as a business trade-off. And then give you sort of a toolkit of the benefits and mitigation strategies to basically be able to make the business case internally for having a stronger open source contributing culture. And if you do that, just a couple of words before leaving is be reasonable in what you want. Listen to others and aim for small wins at first. All right, thank you very much.